Welcome to an episode of InRange. Coming to you today with one of my favorite topics, lever guns. And if you've watched this channel at all, you'd know how much I love lever guns. It's one of my favorite guns to shoot, one of my favorite things to talk about. And if you've watched this channel more, you might know that my favorite lever guns are the 1866 and 1873 pistol caliber Winchester. The 1873 in particular really checked every possible box you'd want for smooth handling, capacity, speed, low recoil, all the things, with one liability, chambered in a pistol caliber. Now, be it it's chambered in 4440 or 44 Winchester centerfire, which can be kind of amped up and turned into a pretty powerful cartridge, it still is ultimately a pistol caliber carbine. In 1892, John Moses Browning was tasked to improve the gun just to bring something else to the market, because by 1892, there were other competitors on the market and Winchester felt like they were being left behind, so they needed to bring out something new, and he designed the 1892 Winchester. However, that was still a pistol caliber carbine, and while he improved the strength and safety of the gun, technically, it actually diminished the handling of the gun. The 73, though, the toggle link action, has the advantage of being extremely smooth. This is a very smooth action. The 92, due to the fact that it's got those locking lugs, you can see it's a little more clunky. Now, to anything but the most discerning shooter, honestly, in practice, it's not going to matter. The 1892 actually left something behind in deference to slightly better weight and slightly better safety. In fact, significantly better safety. That had two locking lugs that locked the action in a way that the toggle link of the 1873 could never do. But in some ways, the 1892 was a step backwards from the 1873. However, 2 years later, take the idea of the 1892, improve on it even more, and chamber it in a rifle caliber, and now you've got something. The 1894 Winchester, which is what we have here on the table, originally came out in a couple black powder cartridges. But only 1 year later, in 1895, Winchester turned this into the very first sporting civilian rifle with the very first smokeless cartridge brought to that market, the .30 Winchester centerfire, which if any of you have been around gunland at all, you've heard of. It's the .30. So you have here, with the modification of the 1892 to the 1894, 1 year later, John Moses Browning's improved 1892 strengthened lever action design, bringing to the market the first commercial smokeless sporting cartridge, and therefore the first commercial sporting smokeless cartridge rifle. And this one, kind of like the 1873, when you talk about rifle chambered lever guns, checks all the check boxes. All the improvements that John Moses Browning brought to the 94 from the 92, but then chambering it in the 3030 cartridge, this thing is, if you're going to get a rifle chambered lever gun, in my opinion, this is the one. And in fact, a lot of people agree with me. Over 7 million of these have been produced. This is, by all standards, the American sporting rifle and the American deer rifle. Who knows how many of these have been used to harvest game for people for subsistence hunting in the field? Immeasurable. However, a lot of things have happened from 1894 to the year we're filming this, 2025. And this gun has gone through a lot of iterations and, at this point, a lot of improvements. But that wasn't always the case. So in 1895, this is released with the 3030 smokeless cartridge, 30 Winchester centerfire. And that's a hit. That is the right answer. They knocked it out of the park. At that point, it is a top eject gun, just like all the other Winchester lever actions, and the idea of optics and all that wasn't even on the table. They continue to manufacture these things in massive numbers. They are the standard rifle chambered, rifle caliber lever gun. 1964, some bean counter comes along and decides that they want to reduce the costs of manufacture of this high-quality sporting arm, and they go to sinter metal production, stamped sheet metal parts, and the 1964 Winchester is a great step backwards in terms of quality and production quality and general consumer quality from the original 1894. In that regard, you have pre-1964 and post 1964 Winchesters. While the sinter metal guns with the stamped sheet metal parts technically functioned, their handling was worse, they were more rough. The bluing, which you couldn't even really do to the sinter metal well, was more like paint, didn't actually have any sort of resiliency. And the 1964 to the mid-1980s, as I understand it, maybe 1990s, I don't know exactly when they got away from this, was kind of a disaster. They produced the gun, they reduced the cost, people still bought them because they were cheaper, but they really were diminished in terms of quality and what they should have been and what the design originally was. However, 1980 something, 1990, they decided this was a mistake and started ramping up the quality again. But in 2006, Winchester stopped manufacture at their facility, and it seemed like that was the end of the 1894. However, that wasn't the case. Only 2 years later, Moroku, the Japanese company, spun up the manufacture of Winchester lever guns, not only the 1894, but the 1892 and other guns, and under the name and under the licensing of Winchester. And interestingly, the 2008 and future guns are probably, actually not probably, they are the highest quality 1894s and 1892 Winchester lever guns ever manufactured. Better than the pre-1964 original ones. Better metallurgy, better manufacturing standards, better quality control, better machining. All those things that Moroku brought to the table, if you want the highest quality lever action Winchester that you can purchase, Moroku's the guys. And they do that under the Winchester brand name. You do not and cannot go wrong with a Moroku Winchester lever gun. Now, other improvements happened with the 1894 during its long production span, which still is happening today. This is a new manufactured gun. A couple of things happened. They moved to a tang safety versus a crossbolt safety, which is a far better system. The originals just had a safety notch. That wasn't considered sufficient, and I kind of agree with that. They added a crossbolt safety at some point. No one liked that. But now we have found the right middle ground. There's a tang safety, which is easily turned on or off with your thumb. That is an active and viable improvement to the gun, which makes it safer to handle and safer in any dynamic environment. And the tang safety really works. It's quick, efficient, and easy to use. Additionally, they added angle eject. So the original Winchesters ejected from the top. Somewhere around 1983, angle eject was added. So what they did is they just changed the ejection. They cut a little bit of the receiver, added a extractor and ejector to eject the cartridge case at about a 45-degree angle out of the receiver instead of out of the top. And that allowed you to drill and tap for scopes. So now the 1894 Winchester was optics compatible. And if you buy a Moroku, they come drilled and tapped ready for scope rings right out of the box. You can easily scope mount an 1894 by just buying some rings and putting on some optics. And the cartridge ejecting will no longer strike your optic in the process of cycling the gun. Angle eject was a significant improvement. But one of the reasons we have to talk about why this gun is so good is partially because of the cartridge that it brought to the market. This is the venerable 3030 or 30 Winchester centerfire. It got the moniker of 3030 because it stuck with some of the old black powder nomenclature. A 30 caliber bullet with 30 grains of smokeless powder. Just like you'd think of 4570 was a 45 caliber bullet with 70 grains of black powder. 3030 was 30 caliber bullet, 30 grains of smokeless powder. The 3030 was never a black powder cartridge. But here's what the 3030 brought to the table that was completely new to the market. Being with an action that was strong enough to handle this and a small bore, meaning 30 caliber, which at that time was small bore. Everything was like 45, 32, even this is smaller than even a 32 in terms of bullet diameter, brought a relatively lightweight bullet, somewhere between 150 to 200 grain bullet, at much higher velocities than people were used to, 2,000 feet per second or even more. That meant that even with a not spitzer, meaning round nose bullet, which is what you need to be safe in a tube-fed magazine, lever revolution and polymer tip bullets notwithstanding, that's a modern iteration. This means that this is a capable rifle, if you know what you're doing, easily to 200 yards with reasonably minimal drop. And if you have a 200-yard zero, While you will get a 50-inch drop at 400 yards, the reality is with a bead sight or adjusting your rear sight or just knowing your holdovers, you can realistically take a standard 30-30 cartridge and without even moving your rear sight, make hits on something easily from 50 to 400 yards.
Hit! 300.
High left.
Left over the left shoulder. Hit! 350.
Just over the left shoulder. Hit!
That video right here is an example of how the 1895 is a far superior design, specifically when in tandem with this 30-30 ammunition. But the smooth and clean action of the 1895, which frequently, due to the fact of the bottlenose cartridge, which I mentioned earlier is easy for loading, is also really easy to cycle into the action. This is a smooth gun. This actually feels smoother to cycle to me than an equivalent 1892 in 4440. This feels not that far off from the smoothness of the 1873 that I love so much, but it's bringing a rifle caliber cartridge and power to the table. When you compare that to 4570, which has this rainbow arc of a trajectory, can be very accurate, but you have to do your range estimation almost perfectly. Think of this as how we think of as 5.56 today, flat shooting. So for a person in the field who wasn't maybe that capable of their range estimation, or range estimation is just difficult, or even for that matter, defeating wind with a higher velocity, smaller weight projectile, but still not that small to get pushed around, you could make some mistakes, but as long as you had a good zero, you'd probably get your hit. This meant that 30-30 was not only easier to use, it was still sufficiently powerful for pretty much any game in the North American continent, and therefore it was the perfect synergy between low recoil, high velocity, easy to shoot, flat shooting cartridge. And it's why the 30-30 still exists today. I do want to do a little shout out right now. Normally we don't do this because we don't have sponsors on this channel. However, we do appreciate people who are community members and are willing and part of the community and support us. And in this regard, I am going to say that all of this 30-30 ammunition you see right here was provided to me by True Shot Ammunition, and they did that so I could shoot this gun at Woodland Brutality, which all the footage you see here is from Woodland Brutality. And so I want to thank True Shot. They actually come out, they shoot our matches, and they provided this 30-30 ammunition for me to shoot at the match. So thank you, True Shot. And normally we don't consider ourselves a sponsored channel, but that is their version of sponsoring the channel and my work, and I appreciate them very much. Thank you for that and for being part of the community. If you are interested in helping support this channel, we are completely demonetized. We take no money from YouTube. We are completely crowdfunded and occasionally get ammo from someone cool like True Shot. You can do that via patreon.com/InRangeTV. Every dollar counts, and your crowd-funded support for this unique voice in the firearms community has kept this channel alive for a decade, and I'm thankful for all of you. All right, now back to the main content. This flat shooting cartridge changed everything. On top of that, it is a bottlenose cartridge, meaning it is not straight wall. And as a result, it's actually very easy to feed these into the King's Gate. That loading gate, which now goes all the way back to the 1866 Winchester, I will admit the smaller version of that gate on the 1892 when you're sticking in 4440 tends to kind of pinch your thumb, and it's a lot of work. Weirdly, and sort of counterintuitively, this longer cartridge, but with this sleek bottlenose design and the larger loading gate, these slip in like butter. This is one of the, if not the quickest of the King's Gate loading system Winchesters, or for that matter, any lever guns that I've ever used. Sliding rounds into this is a easy piece of cake. Having a little sleeve on my gun like this to get quick reloads in this gun, fire a couple on the move, shuck a couple more in through that gate without even pinching your thumb. This is another way in which the 1894 just checks another checkbox. But again, it only really checks that checkbox because of the combination of the cartridge and the gun. Now, I mentioned earlier that some of the safety improvements that came with this 1894 from the 1892, and the big safety improvement was the way that the gun was designed to not be able to be fired out of battery and to protect the firing pin. On the 1892, 2 locking blocks retract from the bolt and go up into the bolt to lock into battery when you're going to shoot the gun. 1892, the firing pin is technically unprotected. If something were to strike the firing pin or the hammer were to drop, it would go off even if it was potentially slightly out of battery. A big problem that was on the 1866 Winchester, which had no safety whatsoever. And I have fired 1866 Winchesters out of battery. It is not fun. It is a spicy moment. But the 1892, while it increased the strength with those locking blocks, it did not have this method of protecting the firing pin. It had a really convoluted bolt design to try and prevent out of battery detonation. However, by adding a transfer bar into the locking block of the 1895 Winchester, you cannot reach the firing pin until the locking block is completely in battery, and at that point, that is when the hammer dropping can strike that transfer bar, transfer the energy to the firing pin, and fire the gun. Ingenious, doing it with one simple part, meaning the locking block is now also your transfer bar safety, and that improved the safety of the gun dramatically. Another way in which the 1894 checked another perfect checkbox. So in this footage, this is one of the stages from Woodland Brutality, and you're going to hear me say 300 and 350. That actually was incorrect. We were shooting at 200-yard targets, 300-yard targets, and when I say 350, that's actually a 400-yard target that someone inappropriate told me was 350. Now, the difference for bullet drop, even with 30-30, from 350 to 400 yards is not sufficient to worry, in that I knew my holdovers and adjusted my sight appropriately, and by holding the bead with this buckhorn sight right over the top of the target at 400 yards, I made reliable iron sight 400-yard hits with 30-30, not even Spitzer bullets. This is really no different than the 30-30 that came out in 1895, and being able to reliably hit a target at 400 yards without too much effort back in that day was a revolutionary, magical change compared to what people were used to with black powder charged large bore cartridges. I hope you enjoy this sort of historical dive and practical shooting content and video with this 1894 Winchester. I love bringing out these old designs to show what they can really do. And the 1894, in my opinion, put a scope on that, have some cartridges in on your buttstock, maybe some in your pocket. This is still a very viable sporting rifle today. And to be honest with you, I would take this over many bolt actions. In fact, I prefer it to bolt actions, but I'm a lever gun guy. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider supporting us, patreon.com/InRangeTV. But if you can't do that, subscribe, click the bell. You may not get a notification. We get shadow banned pretty heavily. But you know what? Here's what you can really do for us. If you could, please share this video in places where you think people will appreciate it. Reddit groups, Facebook groups, friend groups. Send them to your friends, because you can be the organic algorithm when YouTube is not for us. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.